Hello, everyone. This is not for entertainment. It is a historical case file. How leaders used law roads and even winter to swing the balance will make you rethink what power means. Subscribe if you want future episodes sourced straight from the record. In every century, communities across the Southwest, the Ohio country, the Northern Plains, and the Plateau face decisions about land law and survival. The dates are fixed and the places are real. In 1680, at Rio Grande, Pueblo's Pope organized a rising that reset power in the Southwest. In 1791, at the Wabash Blue Jacket of the Shawnee and Little Turtle of the Myaamia led a coalition that stunned the early United States. In 1794, at Fallen Timbers, Anthony Wayne forced a new line, and the Treaty of Greenville followed. In 1811 to 1813, Tecumseh of the Shawnee, known as Shawnee, tried to build a continental bar against piecemeal cessions. In 1835 to 1842, Osceola of the Seminole fought removal in pine and swamp. In 1806, along Lodge Trail Ridge, Red Cloud of the Oglala Lakota closed the Bozeman Road with skill and patience. In June 1876, on the Greasy Grass Sitting Bull of the Hunkpapa Lakota and Crazy Horse of the Oglala helped break a cavalry attack, yet faced a longer winter of pursuit. In 1807, from the Wallowa to Snake Creek Chief, Joseph of the Nimiipuu, known as Nez Perce, led a hard flight under pressure. On the southern plains, Quanah Parker of the Numu, known as Comanche, crossed from war to governance while holding to ceremony and kin. These names anchor a map of policy and war. They also mark the endurance of nations that continue today. The central question is clear. What specific pressures of supplies law, belief, and terrain shaped each decision, and why did those choices decide outcomes felt long after the immediate fight or treaty ended? The deep causes begin in the 17th century Southwest. Between 1671 and 1675, mission governors banned dances, seized ritual items, and ordered labor quotas in Rio Grande towns. In 1675, arrests and executions at Santa Fe hardened Pueblo resolve. Drought in the late 1670s cut harvests and raised tribute pressure. Runners moved between Ohkay Owingeh, Taos, and other towns to coordinate a rising. Powder and shot were scarce, yet local knowledge of terrain and water made movement efficient. Spanish garrisons held horses and steel, yet relied on long supply from the north and south that thinned in dry years. In the Ohio Valley, proximate causes layered after Imperial War. The Proclamation Line of 1763 was set to restrain settlement, yet surveyors soon crossed the Ohio River. The Treaty of Paris 1783 redrew maps without consent of Ohio nations. The Northwest Ordinance 1787 created a territorial frame and invited land sales. By 1790, United States posts rose at Fort Washington and along the Myamis. Traders and land companies pushed roads toward the Maumee. The Myaamia, Shawnee, Delaware, and Wendat built councils and pooled warriors to regulate hunting grounds. Their objective was to hold the Ohio River as a firm boundary. Their constraint was powder flints and lead that moved through British depots and trade routes with delays. United States objectives were secure roads, land sales, and quiet on the frontier. Constraints were distance-poor training and spring mud that stalled wagons. Wayne adjusted by building a chain of posts and cutting roads in 1793 and 1794 to anchor movement and resupply in all seasons. Causes for Tecumseh's stand grew in the first decade of the 19th century. A sequence of treaties ceded tracts by single-town signatures. Tecumseh argued that no single town could sell land held in common. From 1808, the town at Prophetstown gathered families and visitors. The United States read this as a threat and moved to disperse it. In November 1811, at Tippecanoe, a battle broke the settlement and turned neutral towns away. In 1812, alliance with Britain supplied muskets and powder, yet British priorities shifted with the larger war. By 1813, the Confederacy was under strain. Objectives on Tecumseh's side were to block piecemeal cessions and to keep a continental line. Constraints were divided councils and dependence on external powder. United States objectives were to break the Confederacy and reopen settlement. Constraints were two-front war and weak logistics west of the Alleghenies that improved after new depots and boat routes were secured. In Florida, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 set policy frames that hardened into arrest orders and ration leverage. Seminole bands that included Creek refugees and black Seminoles chose wetlands and pine flats as shield. In 1832, a treaty at Payne's Landing was disputed in both content and consent. United States officers listed names on removal rolls that many denied. In December 1835, an arrest parley turned to violence and a column was ambushed in Hammock Country. Osceola's objective was to resist removal and protect kin. Constraints were powder stocks and sickness in flooded seasons. United States objectives were removal and pacification with minimal cost. Constraints were disease, heat, and unfamiliar ground that slowed columns and ruined shoes and tack. Canoes and small bands gave Seminole leaders the logistics edge in swamps, while the Army relied on wagon roads that did not exist, and on rivercraft that could be watched and avoided. On the northern plains, the Bozeman Road opened in 1863 through the heart of the Powder River country to reach goldfields farther west. Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort C.F. Smith were planted in 1865 and 6 to guard the line. Red Cloud of the Oglala Lakota and allied bands saw the road as a direct threat to hunting ranges and winter travel. The objective on the Lakota side was to close the road and force post abandonment. Constraints were powder-led and the seasonal need to move with families and herds. The United States objective was to keep a transit corridor open at tolerable cost. Constraints were stretched supply lines across plains snow and long gaps between forts. Winter itself became an ally for Lakota strategy as wood trains and herds had to move on predictable paths near timber and water. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills in 1874 after a reconnaissance expedition triggered another wave of trespass that destabilized treaty frames agreed in 1868. Buffalo herds collapsed in the 1870s under market hunting and rail access. This removed a foundation of food and trade and forced hard choices across the plains. Army columns grew larger and more mobile, with better repeating arms and more mules, yet still depended on rivers, depots, and grass. Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho alliances could mass for summer defense, but winter campaigns tilted advantage to mounted troops with steady forage and remounts. In the Plateau and Snake River country, the Treaties of 1855 created a large Nimiipuu reservation that was cut down in 1863 when new lines excluded Wallowa. Many families refused to sign. In 1807, after disputes and settler killings, the department ordered non-treaty bands to move to Lapwai by a date certain. Arrests and disarmament followed. The objective for Hinmatawiyishkites was to keep families intact and avoid massacre while seeking a place to live in peace. Constraints were the need to move elders' children and herds across mountains with limited ammunition. United States objectives were to compel consolidation and restore order along new settlement corridors. Constraints were mountainous terrain, long lines of pursuit, and the political demand for quick closure. Across all theaters, administrative frames shifted. In 1849, Indian Affairs moved from the War Department to the Interior Department. In 1871, Congress ended treaty making and moved to agreements and statutes. Ration policies, boarding school regimes, and agency rules pressed language ceremony and travel. Railroads cut travel times for columns and settlers, yet also fixed depots that could be watched and interdicted. Each leader moved inside this mesh of law, supplies, weather, and belief. Objectives were constant to defend land, families, and ways. Constraints were material and human. Logistics decided tempo. Roads, rivers, forage, powder wagons, and winter determined what any commander could promise and deliver. In the Rio Grande Corridor, in August 1680, the rising unfolded as a sequence of localized strikes that revealed both careful planning and the brittleness of colonial supply. At Taos and Pecos, dawn smoke signaled that watchers on ridgelines could confirm the start without written orders. Couriers moved on foot along irrigation banks and through pinyon breaks. Summer heat limited mounted pursuit from scattered garrisons, and the first day's outcome was decisive. Missions were seized and walls whitewashed with years of labor were stripped of bells and crucifixes. Survivors rode south along the river road toward El Paso. The immediate effect was the removal of colonial government from most pueblos and a reset of ceremony in town squares that had long been watched and regulated. The delay in response was measured not in hours, but in weeks as scattered detachments gathered and sent riders to the north and south for instructions. Along the Wabash, in November 1791, the coalition of Myaamia, Shawnee, Delaware, and Wendat struck St. Clair's force near a bend in the river during a cold morning with low clouds that kept gun smoke close to the ground. The place was a tangle of felled trees and half-built huts where camp order had not yet taken hold. Couriers from advance guards had reported movement, but ranks were still forming when fire came in from three sides. The immediate effect was shock and a collapse of the column into a defensive ring that could not hold. Runners carried news north to villages, while officers in the shattered United States force tried to find the road back to Fort Jefferson. The telegraph did not reach this frontier. Messages traveled by rider and flatboat to Fort Washington and then to the seat of government. The delay shaped every decision in the next campaign season because the scale of the defeat took time to measure and explain. In the winter and spring of 1794, Anthony Wayne reversed the communications disadvantage with a chain of posts and cut roads from Greenville toward the rapids of the Maumee. Axemen opened corridors through Oak and Beach, blockhouses anchored supply, patrols moved in steady arcs to seize initiative. Councils at the Glades debated whether to stand or to withdraw families north while testing the steadiness of Wayne's new line. Mixed snow and rain turned clearings to mud and slowed both sides. Yet the posts held, and couriers could move under shelter from one stockade to the next. When the fighting at Fallen Timbers came in August, it flowed from this slow and deliberate staging. On the Wabash again in November 1811, a different signal sequence produced a lasting break. The Prophetstown community at the confluence of the Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers had grown through 1808 and 1809 into a meeting place for visitors from many towns. At dusk on the night before the battle, rain cooled campfires. Interpreters moved between tents with warnings that a fight at dawn would draw in towns that had not committed. The morning attack was confused and costly, and by afternoon the settlement was burning. Immediate effects were seen in the movement of families and the quiet of councils that had filled the town a week earlier. Telegraph lines still did not link this frontier. News moved through British agents by water toward Amherstburg and by riders east to journals that would frame the event as a victory even as fires marked a fracture in the movement. In Florida, in December 1835, winter brought cool air and thin fog to pine flatwoods and hammocks near the Withlacoochee. A scheduled arrest parley turned when words failed and shots came at close range. The same week, a column moving along a rough road of sand and palmetto was cut apart. Canoes slipped into Blackwater creeks, while mounted patrols floundered in sawgrass and cypress knees. Couriers had to move by water, where watchers could count paddles, and by sand paths where prints could be read at noon. The immediate effects were the disruption of removal schedules and the rapid hardening of orders from forts along the Gulf Coast. Detachments began to build small posts near river bends to guard ferries and to stage sweeps into swamps, but every sweep relied on guides who knew which strands of hammock were dry enough for a camp and which channels would drown a mule. Delays were measured in days of rain and fever. On the northern plains in December 1806, the ridge north of Fort Phil Kearny was white with wind-packed snow, and the timber detail had already left the post when scouts reported shadow riders along the tree line. The signal for relief was routine. Wood trains always drew escorts. That routine was the trap. Lures pulled a relief column across a narrow saddle where drifted snow and broken ground slowed formation changes. The fight that followed at Lodge Trail Ridge ended with no survivors in the main relief party. Within hours, runners moved between Lakota and Northern Cheyenne camps. With news while at the post, the telegraph key clicked to Fort Laramie and then eastward. Winter weather slowed every messenger south of the Platte. The immediate effect was a suspension of routine hauling and a tightening of garrison rationing, because wagon access to timber lots had become a battlefield problem. Families near the fort were moved inside the walls, and guards doubled on the corrals. The next season saw repetition with variation. War parties watched for wood trains and herds. When spring thaw turned the road to ruts, posts relied on short-range patrols and on timber cut inside narrow perimeters. Summer brought more traffic and more risk. In each case, the delay in relief was built into the distance between posts and the fact that support had to pass the same choke points under the same bluffs. By late 1867, the cost ledger for keeping the road open had shifted against the forts even before any treaty lines were redrawn. In the Northern Plains high summer of 1876, signals and delays shaped the largest clash of the era. Village smoke on the valleys near the Little Bighorn River was seen by scouts in heat haze. Couriers rode to and from converging columns, and interpreters' words in one camp were heard differently in another as commanders tried to guess the size and location of a moving village. Dry heat kept dust high and horses thirsty. When the fight broke in separate pieces, the immediate effect was a tactical rout of one wing of the attacking force, and a shock that ran by telegraph over new lines to the railheads and eastward. Within weeks, columns moved in larger formations. The delay that had protected summer villages in past years vanished as rail and river shortened the time between order and presence. In the Plateau Country in May and June 1807, sheriffs and soldiers carried arrest orders into the Wallowa and down the Snake. The weather turned from late snow to rain to bright heat in a single month. A set date for removal to Lapwai collided with grief and retaliation after settler killings. The decision to move with families was made under pressure and with incomplete maps of the country ahead. Couriers tried to find sympathetic ranchers or friendly agents who might slow the pursuit. Telegraph from posts along the Salmon and the Clearwater sent updates to departments that were already preparing columns. The immediate effects were a march east over Lolo Pass and then south through Yellowstone, where tourists and scouts became witnesses. Skirmishes flared at river crossings when wagons or stock crowded the banks, and the need to protect elders and children limited options. Each day's march was a logistics problem, solved at dawn and reviewed at midnight by firelight. Across all these theaters, one pattern appears. Incidents escalated pressure because signals moved imperfectly, and because each side relied on routines the other could study. Forts sent the same-sized escorts to the same woodlots. Columns camped in the same meadows, near the same water. Councils met at the same forks in the same seasons. Leaders turned those habits into openings, or into traps. The result was not only battles and raids, but displacements, seizures of grain and horses, and families moved inside walls or into the timber. The record speaks in short orders and in longer silences, where we reconstruct intent from movement and from who was where on a given day. Anthony Wayne, General Order Greenville, 1794-02. The line will advance by works and by discipline. Posts will be secured and supplied before the next march. Rash pursuit is forbidden. The country will be opened by road, not by ardor. The excerpt captures a core lesson that appears again in later wars and flights. Where roads and posts anchored movement, the side that held them could set tempo. Where winter and distance broke those anchors, initiative passed to mobile bands that knew which creek froze first and which ridge caught the morning wind. The Rio Grande campaign of 1680 to 1692 followed a pattern of revolt consolidation and reconquest. The initial order of battle for Pueblo towns was decentralized. Each town fielded men with captured muskets, lances, bows, and wooden shields. Horses taken in the first week increased mobility between towns. Spanish forces that survived the first strikes withdrew south along the river road to El Paso, where garrisons reorganized. Over the next seasons, Pueblo leaders held councils to coordinate defense while reestablishing ceremony. Spanish returns list small forays that failed to retake central towns. In 1692, a reconquest column advanced upriver with cavalry and mission priests offering terms of submission and protection of limited self-rule. Skirmishes and negotiated entries alternated. Casualties in the opening month of 1680 are described in friar narratives and later depositions as dozens to low hundreds across the corridor, with higher losses during flight. Non-combatants moved between towns under watch. Logistics stress is visible in notarial lists of grain and salt taken from mission stores and in water schedules that determined daily marches. The final settlement left Pueblo offices restored and set rules that limited direct interference in ceremony, even as colonial authority returned. In the Ohio country, the order of battle shifted after the disaster of November 1791 on the Wabash. The coalition under Little Turtle and Blue Jacket deployed in enveloping files through timber and brush, using the half-built camp and fallen trees as choke points. United States returns list about 900 casualties killed and wounded, with artillery pieces lost and supply ruined on the ground. Survivors struggled back to Fort Jefferson and then to Fort Washington. Over the winter, the new commander Anthony Wayne trained a small regular army with drilled platoon fire and bayonet practice. He built a march by entrenchment that began at Greenville in 1793 and moved by stages to Fort Recovery, and then down the line to Fort Defiance and Fort Deposit. The roads cut through forest allowed wagons and cattle to move even in rain. This removed the coalition's advantage in striking strung-out columns. The fight at Fallen Timbers in August 1794 lasted less than an hour on open ground, where fallen trees from an earlier storm gave some cover but could not stop a rapid bayonet push supported by dragoons. Coalition casualties in contemporary accounts range from several dozen to over 100, while United States returns list about 30 killed, with similar wounded. Refuge at the British post on the Maumee Rapids did not produce intervention, and councils soon agreed to terms at Greenville. Families north of the boundary adjusted hunting ranges under annuity schedules, while United States survey lines advanced. Tecumseh's campaign from 1808 to 1813 was a traveling confrontation that mixed diplomacy and war. The town at Prophetstown gathered speakers and visitors from many nations along the Wabash and Tippecanoe. In November 1811, the territorial governor's column approached in a tense standoff that broke at dawn into close combat. Both sides suffered dozens of casualties, and the settlement was burned. The political effect was larger than the tactical score. Towns on the fence withdrew support. When the war with Britain opened in 1812, Tecumseh's line reformed along the Detroit and the Thames, with British muskets and limited powder. The retreat toward the east in 1813 ended at the Moravian town, where a short fight collapsed the line. Contemporary returns put Allied losses higher than the pursuing United States column, and Tecumseh fell in the final exchange. Fact versus folklore disputes persist over the exact spot and who saw the body in the confusion of the pursuit. The strategic result is clear. Without Tecumseh, the continental argument against piecemeal cessions lost its central organizer. In Florida, the Second Seminole War showed how a smaller force could translate terrain into time. The order of battle on Seminole's side was broken into kin groups moving through hammocks and along Blackwater. United States columns began with regulars and militia and soon included Marines and mounted volunteers. Rules of engagement hardened after early ambushes. In October 1837, General Thomas Jesup ordered seizure of leaders under flag with the logic that the war could not end without removal. Osceola was taken at a parley near Fort Peyton and later died in captivity. Columns then executed sweeps that depended on shallow draft boats and pack trains. Casualty returns list hundreds of United States dead from combat and disease across years, with Seminole casualties uncounted and measured instead in captured families and removals west. Non-combatants bore the weight of policy. Agency rolls show children tallied for transport and ration issues recorded to compel movement. Swamp fever, ruined shoes, and drowned mules appear in quartermaster notes that reveal logistics strain more than any official dispatch. On the northern plains, the contest over the Bozeman Road produced a campaign with a simple objective. Red Cloud's line was to make the road unusable until the forts were abandoned. United States order of battle in 1806 centered on Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort C.F. Smith, with companies of infantry and cavalry under commanders who rotated. Wood trains needed guards every day, and that repetition produced opportunity. On 1806 December 21st, a decoy party led soldiers from Phil Kearny across the saddle north of the post, where a planned fight at Lodge Trail Ridge destroyed the relief column. Army returns list 81 dead in the relief party and several dead and wounded in supporting fights. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne losses are reported in winter counts as a handful. The first contact at the Wood Road was a habit turned into a weapon. Over the next year, patterns repeated until the treaty table followed the ledger. Supply to the forts in winter required long wagon lines under snow and wind. The costs grew, and the posts were given up by treaty. The road closed as Red Cloud demanded. The campaign of 1876, 76 in the northern plains, followed a larger order of battle with 3 army columns set to converge. Sitting Bull as political and spiritual leader and Crazy Horse as a field leader kept allied villages moving, seeking to avoid winter confinement and to control where fights occurred. In June, the 7th Cavalry pushed into a valley on the Little Bighorn and struck a village larger than expected. The fight split along the ridges. Returns list 268 United States dead and dozens wounded, with Allied casualties recorded in a range from 50 to 100 across accounts. The humanitarian outcome was shaped by what followed. Pursuit in winter cut herds and food, and families split to reduce risk. By early 1807, bands surrendered under pressure, while others fled north to join Sitting Bull beyond the border. Fact and folklore disputes appear in later retellings of precise movements inside the valley and in death scenes for named leaders. The weight of evidence is a tactical defeat for a wing of the assault and a strategic failure to translate that shock into long-term advantage. In 1807, the Nimiipuu flight under Hinmatawishkites showed a campaign where the line of march is the central text. The first order was an agency directive to move non-treaty bands to Lapwai by a fixed date. After violence in the Wallowa and along the Salmon, the decision was made to move with families towards safer ground. The march from the Imnaha to Lolo Pass and south through Yellowstone into the Absaroka and the Missouri Breaks covered almost 1,400 miles in less than 5 months. Order of movement placed scouts and skirmishers ahead, family groups and herds in the center and rear guards, with trusted fighters at the back. Army columns under several commanders attempted to fix the line at river crossings. Small fights at Clearwater and Big Hole brought heavy cost, with United States returns listing dozens of dead and wounded, and Nimiipuu losses, including women and children, caught in dawn attacks. Later fights at Canyon Creek and Bear Paw ended the march short of the border after cold and hunger closed options. Casualty ranges across the campaign vary, but the human ledger is clear in the burial lists at Big Hole and in the number of families counted at the final surrender meadow. Non-combatants suffered most. After-action reports acknowledge the skill of mounted fighters and the difficulty of winter marches against a mobile opponent. On the southern plains, the Red River War of 1874 to 1875 linked to the story of Quanah Parker and the Numu shift from war to governance. The order of battle placed several United States columns in a converging movement across the Llano Estacado and the Palo Duro Breaks. Intelligence came from scouts and from buffalo hide hunters whose presence had already stripped herds and transformed trade. In September 1874, a dawn descent into Palo Duro Canyon broke multiple native camps by stampeding and seizing horse herds. The immediate humanitarian outcome was travel on foot for families and a collapse of mobility as winter approached. Over that winter and spring, bands surrendered at agencies where ration control and the promise of protection for kin weighed more than continued flight. Quanah Parker then emerged as a mediator between agency demands and community continuance, organizing raids no more, and focusing on ranch work, ceremonial leadership, and political representation within the new frame of reservation law. Orders and reports from these campaigns carry plain lessons. Anthony Wayne, General Order Fort Recovery Line, 1794, EO7. No advance without a post to sustain it. The road is our lifeline. Nelson Miles, After Action Report. Yellowstone Country, 1877, 01. Winter marches are decisive against villages, but the cost in men and stock will be high unless transport is improved. Policy frames run underneath. In 1849, the administration of Indian Affairs moved from war to interior. In 1871, Congress ended treaty-making, replacing it with agreements and statutes that reduced diplomatic ceremony while increasing paperwork and court paths. Arrest orders, school placements, and ration schedules became tools of law that shaped campaigns as surely as rifles and horses. The enforcement sequences are visible in agency logs that show children assigned to schools for long seasons and families marked present or absent on ration day. Resistance and negotiation beats alternate in the same ledgers where names appear as signers and then as petitioners. On the ground, effects followed the calendar. In winter, men and horses weakened and agency leverage rose. In summer, mobile villages could choose when to fight and where to pass. Where fact and folklore part ways, the record is mixed but not silent. The surrender words attributed to Chief Joseph at Snake Creek exist in several versions filtered through interpreters and reporters. The enduring line of, "I will fight no more forever," is a later smoothing of longer statements. The death of Crazy Horse at a fort near the Platte is described in contradictory witness accounts about restraint and a bayonet in confusion. We mark these gaps, but do not mistake them for absence. Dispatches returns winter counts and family testimony together outline the same spine. Leaders made decisions under supply and law. Roads, rivers forage powder wagons, and winter decided tempo. Non-combatants carried the worst of it, and the next generation rebuilt government and ceremony in the spaces policy left open. Turning points came when a single day or order shifted initiative from one side to the other and kept it through the next season. In the Rio Grande, the first hinge stands at Santa Fe in 1692 when the Reconquest column entered towns that had held out since the Rising. The objective for Pueblo leaders had been to restore ceremony and local rule. Constraints were powder and the risk of siege. The objective for the colonial column was a negotiated return at bearable cost. Constraints were grain water and distance up the river road. The immediate effect of the settlements was a partial restoration of colonial authority with explicit room for Pueblo governance. Initiative moved into a negotiated middle. Families remained in place. The winter counts of memory in this corridor mark years by drought, flood, and feast rather than by battles alone. The displacement path here was temporal more than geographic. Ceremony returned inside the same plazas where it had been suppressed. In the Ohio country, the hinge is Fallen Timbers in August 1794, near the Myaamia Rapids. The coalition objective was to hold the Ohio River boundary and to break United States columns before they could entrench. Constraints were powder flints and wavering support from British posts. The United States objective was to bring a trained force to open ground supported by dragoons and to hold the ground by a chain of posts. Constraints were distance mud and a recent record of defeat. The brief fight and the weeks of secure movement that followed shifted initiative to Wayne. Within a year, the Treaty of Greenville redrew lines. Families in Myaamia, Shawnee, Delaware, and Wendat communities moved within constrained hunting grounds while annuities flowed by schedule. The human cost is written in casualty lists from St. Clair's disaster that still echo in family stories and in the names cut into later pension files for United States survivors. The counterfactual is narrow and material. If British officers had allowed coalition fighters to resupply or to shelter behind their works that day, the line at Greenville might have been negotiated from a position of parity. If United States roads and posts had failed in the spring rains, the summer fight could have been delayed until disease and harvest broke the column. For Tecumseh, the hinge is the Thames in October 1813. The objective was to maintain a continental bar against piecemeal cessions. Constraints were divided councils and British priorities that shifted as the wider war demanded. The United States objective was to destroy the alliance by breaking its field army. In retreat, the line could not hold. Tecumseh fell, and the organizing center was gone. Towns that had hesitated signed later agreements from a weaker position. The counterfactual again is practical. If steady powder and food from British depots had reached the field through the summer, the final stand might have occurred on better ground, or not at all. If Prophetstown had not been burned 2 years prior, more towns might have endured the strain of a long war. The human cost lies in the quiet of later council fires, where a speaker was missing, and in scattered villages that mark a movement cut short. In Florida, a hinge moment came not on a single field, but at a flag of truce in October 1837 near Fort Peyton. Jessup ordered seizure of leaders at Parley. The objective was removal without the endless cost of small war. Constraints were disease, heat, and a map of water and grass that favored the defenders. The immediate effect was to decapitate a movement that had been fighting on chosen ground. Osceola died in captivity. Families were seized and counted for removal. The displacement path ran by river and road to new lands far west. Children appear in ledgers by number and by rations. The counterfactual is legal and human. If the disputed treaty had been renegotiated with full consent, or if the arrest under truce had not occurred, the war might still have burned, but with different terms of trust and parole that could have shortened the harm. On the northern plains, the hinge rests on the ledger pages around the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. Red Cloud's objective was to close the Bozeman Road. Constraints were winter food powder and the safety of camps. The United States objective was to keep a transit corridor to distant gold fields. Constraints were cost loss of escorts and the arithmetic of 3 small forts isolated by weather. After the destruction of the relief column at the Lodge Trail Ridge, the year settled into attrition that the forts could not pay. The treaty abandoned the road and ordered the posts down. Initiative passed to the Oglala demand. The human cost is counted in winter counts that mark the death of named warriors and in agency rolls that later record families moving for rations as the buffalo declined. A counterfactual stands in supply. If the road had been shifted south to easier ground with larger depots, or if winter wagon trains had used better stock and more outriders, the posts might have held another season. But the structure of distance and wind cut those hopes. The summer of 1876 gave a tactical shock to the United States at the Greasy Grass and a strategic hinge a season later. The objective for allied Lakota Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho was to defend a summer village and preserve the freedom of movement that made their economy work. Constraints were powder remounts and the collapse of herds. The United States objective was to force bans onto agencies by closing options with converging columns. Constraints were grass for animals and the old problem of distance. The immediate effect of the fight was a broken wing of the assault and grief on the plains. The deeper effect was a winter campaign that cut food and horses until bands could no longer stay out. The counterfactual is hard-edged. If buffalo herds had not collapsed under market hunting, and if columns had lacked rail and river support, the strategic picture after the battle might have favored a return to earlier seasonal independence. The human cost shows in burial places along the Tongue and Powder, and in families who crossed north to escape pursuit and hunger. The last hinge in this arc lies at Snake Creek near Bear Paw in early October 1807. Hinmatawayish Kites led Nimiipuu families almost 1,400 miles in search of safety. The objective at the end was to cross into a different jurisdiction and avoid annihilation. Constraints were cold hunger and little ammunition. The United States objective was to prevent that crossing and compel surrender. Constraints were worn stock and the short grass of autumn. The immediate effect was a stand that held through cold nights until elders and children could go no farther. Names are remembered here. Olcott fell earlier in the campaign. Women and children died in the Big Hole attack weeks before and are buried near the river. The displacement path after surrender ran to distant forts and then to a reservation far from the Wallowa. The counterfactual is visible in policy. If earlier negotiations had acknowledged the refusal to sign the 1863 line, or had set apart Wallowa as originally understood, there may have been no flight. If the Army had lacked fresh mounts and winter stores, the final stand might have ended with a crossing. Admission against interest. Nelson Miles, After Action Report, Tongue River Country, 1877, 01. These people maneuver with skill equal to any mounted troops I have encountered. We cannot catch them without winter marches and better transport, and even then at great cost. Turnings like these return us to the structural forces traced in the buildup. Powder food horses' roads, rivers and seasons governed what leaders could promise and what families could endure. Where a side held posts and cut roads, initiative shifted to drilled ranks and steady supply. Where winter and distance broke those anchors, initiative shifted to mobile bands, who knew which creek froze first and which ridge cut the wind. Policy frames also tilted outcomes. The move from war to interior administration and the end of treaty-making narrowed negotiation paths and elevated arrest orders and ration ledgers as tools of command. Each hinge sits at the crossing of material and legal lines. The names of leaders mark decisions, but the longer lines of rail depots, river crossings, annuity schedules, and school calendars decided how long any victory could last and what surrender meant for the next generation. After the crises described in earlier parts, law and administration fixed new boundaries and routines that shaped daily life for generations. In the Rio Grande Corridor after 1692, Pueblo towns rebuilt offices and kivas under a negotiated coexistence. Mission inventories and notarial lists from the Reconquest decade show grain and stock allocations alongside pledges to respect certain ceremonies. Later in United States jurisdiction, the Pueblos navigated territorial law and secured land confirmations that recognized older grants. Parish registers and county deeds attest to continuance as Pueblos kept fields and offices while contesting taxes and water rights in county courts. The record is plain that ceremony resumed in plazas that had been watched before, and that local government persisted through later statehood. In the Ohio country, the Treaty of Greenville of 1795 is the administrative hinge. The text sets annuities by schedule and enumerates posts and tracts to be ceded. Survey lines advanced as promised, and reservation tracts promised on paper narrowed through later agreements and removals. United States Army returns from the St. Clair Inquiry, and Anthony Wayne's campaign entered the ledger as lessons learned, while the treaty itself became the instrument that opened most of present-day Ohio to rapid settlement. The demographic shift can be read in federal census schedules for the early 19th century, where Ohio counties filled and native tracts shrank or were erased by later treaties. The Myaamia reappear in removal lists to present-day Oklahoma, and later in 20th century, restoration of governance recognized in federal registers. The Shawnee bands appear in rolls for present-day Kansas and Oklahoma. In the 21st century, the Myaamia Center at Miami University is an institutional proof of continuance in language and education programs run by the nation itself. The Ohio and Great Lakes story folds into the biography of Tecumseh by administrative means rather than a single battlefield decree. After the Thames in 1813, councils that had once counted on a continental bar against piecemeal cessions faced agents with treaty drafts and annuity promises. Commissioner of Indian Affairs reports from the 1810s and 1820s list signers from towns that once gathered at Prophetstown, now negotiating for rations and blacksmith services in a world defined by lines the United States drew. The mechanism of policy is visible in those reports as annuity rosters list heads of families and as school placements appear in later decades under mission and federal supervision. The demography here is a story of dispersal and reassembly across agency lists, a slow rebuilding of councils inside new borders. In Florida, the Second Seminole War converted law into transport. General Thomas Jessup's 1837 correspondence orders the seizure of leaders under truce, with the explicit rationale that the war could not end without removal. That order appears again in congressional inquiries and in War Department files. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 provides the earlier statutory frame. After the fighting, mixed records track families west along river and road. The annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for 1838 lists numbers removed and rations issued. Mortality from fever and exposure is recorded in surgeon reports, while births and school placements show in agency ledgers a decade later. Yet, continuance in Florida persisted. Today, the autonyms Seminole and Miccosukee name nations whose government, schools, and cultural programs operate in present-day Florida, while the Seminole Nation in present-day Oklahoma carries its own government and community events. Black Seminole descendants maintain memory across borders in Texas, Mexico, and beyond. On the northern plains, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 is the main administrative text. It closed the Bozeman Road and ordered forts abandoned. Commissioner records and the printed treaty show the promise of a defined territory for Lakota and allied nations. That line did not hold. Reports following the 1874 reconnaissance into the Black Hills describe gold finds that led to trespass and then to policy changes. By the mid-1870s, new orders demanded agencies on fixed lines and winter campaigns against bands outside those lines. Army returns from Fort Phil Kearny and later from the 1876 to 1877 season show the slow tightening of rations and horse seizures. The human cost appears in winter counts that name those who fell in the Lodge Trail fight and in later attacks, and in ledger art that records the Bear Paw Stand and other scenes. Far later, the Supreme Court decision in United States v. Sioux Nation in 1980 acknowledged a taking of the Black Hills and set compensation that the nation has refused as a matter of principle, a legal echo of the older promise in the 1868 text. Present-day Oglala Lakota, Hunkpapa. Lakota and other Lakota governments operate court schools and language programs in present-day South Dakota and North Dakota with ceremonies and community events marking the calendar each year. The 1876 campaign and its aftermath also altered health and demography across the plains. Buffalo collapse under market hunting and rail access forced dietary shifts. Agency ration issues replaced winter hunts and created dependence that policy then used as leverage. Mission and federal boarding schools removed children for long seasons. The Dawes Act of 1887 and the Curtis Act of 1898 cut reservations into allotments and opened surplus lands to settlement. Agency maps show checkerboards replacing contiguous land. Grazing leases and rail spurs carved new rights-of-way across former common ranges. These facts are not abstractions. They appear in allotment case files, in railroad right-of-way agreements, and in mortality lists during epidemic years when smallpox and influenza passed along new corridors. For the Nimiipuu, the administrative line runs from the Treaties of 1855 and 1863 to the long 1877 pursuit to later reservations far from the Wallowa. The 1855 text promised a large reservation. The 1863 agreement, signed by some but not all leaders, cut Wallowa from the reserved land. Orders in the spring of 1807 forced non-treaty bands to Lapwai, and after the campaign, the survivors were taken first to distant forts and later to a reservation far from the basalt canyons of home. Commissioner reports for 1807 and 1878 detail numbers moved and rations issued. Yellowstone superintendent notes and Army dispatches describe the march through the park, stitching civilian observation into official files. Today, the autonym Nimiipuu anchors governments in present-day Idaho and in a community on the Colville Reservation in present-day Washington. Language revitalization fisheries, co-management on treaty rivers, and commemorations at Bear Paw Battlefield mark continuance. Museum exhibits and community memory walks use ledger art and descendant testimony to carry names forward when paper files fall silent. On the southern plains, the Red River War ended in surrenders to agencies that controlled food and movement. Quartermaster vouchers from the Palo Duro campaign list captured horse herds and seized stores. The shift in power is visible in those numbers. Families walked where they had ridden before. In the years that followed, the autonym Numu, known in English as Comanche, reorganized government under reservation law, built ranching economies, and sustained ceremony. The Peyote Road carried a religious continuance into the modern era. Agency censuses and court records show leaders like Quanah Parker working both as statesmen and as guardians of kin and practice. In the present, the Comanche Nation operates programs in health education and culture in present-day Oklahoma while collaborating with museums on accurate representation in exhibits and repatriation. Boarding schools and allotment bound all these stories together. Carlisle and its sister schools recorded children by number and English name and held them through long seasons away from home. Photographs and school registers survive as both evidence and wound. Allotment files show daughters and sons inheriting fractured tracts and leasing under rules they did not write. Yet winter counts continued new ledger books filled with drawings of battles and ceremonies and community commemorations fixed memory to place. At Greasy Grass memorials at Bear Paw Prayer runs at Fort Phil Kearney and along the Bozeman Trail and in Plaza, dances along the Rio Grande, the calendar of remembrance holds. Citations in prose for the record backbone include the Treaty of Greenville, 1795, printed by the United States, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, and Commissioner Journal's GSUP's October 1837 correspondence in War Department files regarding seizure under truce U.S. Army returns from the 1791 St. Clair Inquiry and the 1866 to 1877 campaigns. Commissioner of Indian Affairs, annual reports for 1838, 1868, and 1877, listing removals, rations, and enrollments, the Nez Perce Treaties of 1855 and 1863 in the Territorial Treaty Volumes, and the Supreme Court decision, United States v. Sioux, Nation of Indians, 1980, acknowledging the Black Hills taking. Present day, continuance closes the arc. Ohkay Owingeh Taos and other pueblos govern themselves within present-day New Mexico. Myaamia, Shawnee, Delaware, and Wendat descendants maintain governments and programs across present-day Oklahoma, Kansas, and beyond with language work in universities and tribal schools. Seminole and Miccosukee governments operate in present-day Florida, and the Seminole Nation governs in present-day Oklahoma. Oglala Lakota, Hunkpapa. Lakota and other Lakota nations hold elections, operate courts, and run language and health programs across the northern plains. Nimiipuu governments steward fisheries and language. The Comanche Nation sustains cultural and educational programs and a modern economy. Across these nations, the measure of aftermath is not only in loss, but in continuance recorded in law, ledgers, winter counts, and the living calendar of ceremony. Across 3 centuries, scholars converge on several conclusions. First, leadership shaped outcomes only within the limits of supply law and terrain. Pope, Blue Jacket, Little Turtle, Tecumseh, Osceola, Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Chief, Joseph, and Quanah Parker read those limits with unusual clarity, yet powder roads, rivers, forage, and administrative frames set the outer walls of choice. Second, negotiation and war were not opposites but a single continuum. The same figures spoke across treaty tables and then fought on trails because policy and pressure moved in cycles that required both. Third continuance is measurable. Nations named here endured removals, allotment, and schools, and now run governments, courts, and programs, which means the largest legacy is not a battlefield map, but institutions still at work. Points remain contested. Numbers at the Little Bighorn vary across accounts, and the distribution of casualties inside the valley is reconstructed from ground finds and testimony that disagree in details while agreeing on the tactical result. The surrender words attributed to Chief Joseph at Snake Creek survive in several versions that pass through interpreters and reporters, which has led some historians to prefer longer field notes over later smoothed phrases, while others accept the condensed line as faithful to meaning, if not to syllable. The scale of British material support to Tecumseh's alliance also shifts by month and depot list, and debate continues over how far that support could have changed the last season if sustained. Even at Fort Phil Kearny, scholars weigh different winter counts and Army returns to estimate Lakota and Northern Cheyenne losses in the fight. Near Lodge Trail Ridge, a reminder that silence in some records does not erase names kept in others. The enduring legacy is threefold. In doctrine, the United States learned that roads posts and winter campaigns decide tempo as much as any charge, a lesson carried into later frontier and overseas operations. In reform, the legal aftershocks run from the Fort Laramie text to 20th century court cases over takings and to present-day compact and co-management regimes that restore pieces of older promises. In symbol, these 10 leaders stand for continuance under pressure. Their portraits and winter counts and ledger drawings are used in classrooms and council houses to teach how communities survive policy shifts and hard seasons. What endures in memory is the proof that leadership joined to land law and logistics can bend events without breaking a people, and that the nations named here remain present and self-governing in the places their ancestors fought to keep. We traveled from files and field orders to winter roads, seeing how law, logistics, and terrain decide a nation's fate. In your view, which moment in this episode swung the balance most? Which figure changed your perspective? What event should we dig into next? Thanks for watching.